A mixed-up grid in Belgium set up a fascinating Grand Prix, with many DRS overtakes down the Kemmel Straight. But through it all, we've seen an absolute masterclass from Max Verstappen, who went from 14th position on the grid to then lead the race in just 18 laps. There's a lot to talk about, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Belgian Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Max's masterclass. Today was one of Verstappen's finest performances. He had the fastest car of anyone on the grid, and he started 14th, which became 13th after a late pit lane start for Pierre Gasly. But Verstappen made it look effortless, keeping himself out of trouble through the crowded turn 1, to then take advantage of the early incidents to get himself up to 8th after lap 1, just before the safety car came out to recover Hamilton and Bottas's cars. By lap 12, Verstappen had the lead of the race, albeit he was leading having not stopped while other cars around him had. But once he did stop, he overtook Sainz for the lead on lap 18, not even halfway through the Grand Prix. Not only this, but in that first stint, Verstappen managed to make the soft tyres last further than so many other drivers. Sure, he benefited from a few laps under the safety car, but everyone had that same benefit, and he still made the first stint last longer than many of the drivers that started on the medium tyres, despite the fact that Max had to work hard to get through the traffic early on. It was a brilliant display of skill and shows just how powerful that Red Bull car was this weekend, as they had superior straight line speed over their rivals, which made it so easy for those drivers down the Kemmel Straight. Once Verstappen was leading, he built a comfortable gap to the rest of the drivers and seemed to cruise to the finish. I believe he could have won this race wherever he started, whether that was from P20 on the grid or even in the pit lane, such was his advantage around Spa. It was a performance that laid down a marker going into the second half of the season as he edges closer to securing his second World Championship with races to spare. So in the end, it became a bit of a lonely race out of the front for Max Verstappen. He secured the fastest lap, he led the majority of them, and won by more than 17 seconds in the end. It was an excellent performance, and it will go down as one of Verstappen's most comfortable wins. So for me, I'm going to give this performance the first ever purple box of the 5 Things We Learned series, a box reserved for truly exceptional performances, and that's exactly what we saw this afternoon from Max Verstappen. Sebastian Vettel proves he won't give up in his final races. Through the summer break, Sebastian Vettel announced his retirement from Formula 1. We also saw 2-time world champion Mika Häkkinen claim that he struggled to maintain his concentration once he knew that he was heading towards his retirement back in 2001. But it doesn't seem like Vettel got that memo, as he managed to secure 8th position in his Aston Martin in a race where he was competing with the Alpines and was well ahead of the McLarens. I've said this for a few races now, but Aston Martin are starting to knock on the door of points-paying positions on a more regular basis. It was only a matter of time before the team started to secure handfuls of points rather than single ones. And that's what Vettel achieved this weekend. In the race, he managed to keep himself ahead of the Alex Albon-led DRS trains that were forming behind the Williams driver with his extreme low downforce setup. And it was this strategic positioning which allowed him to finish in that 8th spot. I would argue that Vettel has achieved an excellent result, especially finishing 8th in a team that's 9th in the constructors' standings, and the team will surely be wanting to take the fight to AlphaTauri and Haas over these last races in 2022, and Vettel will want to leave the sport, proving he can still compete in Formula 1. So it's clearly a green box for Sebastian Vettel this weekend. Albon continues to deliver in his Williams. Alex Albon has had a summer where he's signed a multi-year deal with Williams. His return to the sport certainly looks like it's been a success for the Thai driver as he's regaining his reputation in the sport. This weekend was a great example of that. Williams are a team that are willing to take risks when they don't have the best car. They did that through 2021 with George Russell, and they did it again this weekend as they went for an extremely low downforce setup, which was actually the fastest of all cars through Sector 1 as they had unbelievable amounts of straight line speed. As such, Albon managed to put his car 9th in qualifying, which became 6th after the grid drops ahead of him, which was his best start of the year. Of course, there were faster cars behind him, but Albon was always going to be tricky to overtake, as even with DRS, the straight line speed differential wouldn't be there for his opponents behind him. This was the case towards the end of the second stint and towards the end of the race, as Albon was leading a 5-car train towards the end as he defended his 10th position in those closing stages. In my video regarding what each driver needs to do to call 2022 a success, I said that Alex Albon needed to score a couple more points for the Williams team. Well, he's already got one from this race, and it was a hard-fought point, just as his point was back in Australia, where again, the Williams team took risks. So it's obviously a green box for Albon, who's continued to fight for top 10s despite being in the slowest car on the grid. Grid drop nonsense. Formula 1 was its classic confusing self in Belgium. All 20 of the drivers started the Grand Prix in a different place to where they qualified, after 7 drivers received a power unit related grid drop and both AlphaTauri drivers started in the pit lane. So that meant that Valtteri Bottas, who qualified 20th and had a 30-place grid penalty, started 13th on the grid, which was the 12th car after Gasly's last-minute pit lane start. It was an absolute mess, and for many fans it created complete and utter confusion, as it wasn't clear who would be starting where. It's a sign of just how complex Formula 1 can be, especially with Bottas and Alfa Romeo exploiting a loophole in the regulations which meant he didn't have a back-of-the-grid penalty, but instead a 30-place penalty, which even saying that out loud now sounds incredibly confusing considering there are only 20 cars on the grid. The FIA themselves were even confused, as initially Charles Leclerc and Ferrari collected 2 separate grid drops totaling 20 positions, but neither single penalty exceeded 15 places, the requirement to qualify for a back-of-the-grid start. This was the way it was interpreted by the governing body on Friday, but by Saturday the stewards reviewed the situation and claimed that there was a gap between the way the rules are written and the intention of the regulation. So once again, it was an example of where FIA-nominated representatives don't fully understand their own regulations. This isn't exactly a great look for Formula 1, and especially for new fans, this whole concept of grid drops creates confusion, which could potentially put people off watching. How can Verstappen qualify first and then have a back-of-the-grid start, which resulted in a 14th on the grid and actually a 13th car in the order at the start? It was a confusing situation all round. I thought that The Race wrote an interesting article offering options for solving this issue, with the proposals ranging from the current situation being a necessary evil, to the grid drops needing to be simplified, to even championship points deductions replacing grid drops. For me, I think that whatever happens, it needs to be simplified. The current situation isn't fit for being inclusive and welcoming to new fans into Formula 1. There must be a better way, and perhaps the rule makers would do well to read that article and look to solve this issue going forwards. I think it's necessary to limit the number of power unit elements for a given season, as this ensures the teams don't overspend and the rich teams don't take advantage of their ability to pay more for power units each weekend. So for me, it's too complex, and there must be a better way to ensure there are more reasonable penalties that are easier to understand. So for me, it's a red box for the FIA, as there's still a long way to go to work on the simplification of the rules. A Ferrari strategy mistake. Ferrari came into this weekend knowing that they needed to win most, if not all, of the races over the rest of the season, to stand a chance of catching up to Red Bull and Max Verstappen. But today, it looked like Ferrari were more concerned with Mercedes in the race than Red Bull ahead of them. The whole weekend, they looked behind Red Bull, especially when that car was in the hands of Max Verstappen. But with Leclerc starting alongside Verstappen in the midfield pack, anything could happen. The race itself saw Ferrari not committing to their strategy. After a season littered with strategic mistakes, the team were now seemingly putting more pressure on their drivers to make the decisions, as they were asking for Leclerc which tyre he would like without giving him the information of how those different tyre compounds were working for other cars in the race. It was a sign that the Ferrari team aren't confident when it comes to strategy. I've said on several occasions that Leclerc needs to speak up more, but he needs to be asking the questions such as how are the hard tyres working for their opponents. It just feels like the conversation is sometimes a bit clueless. Carlos Sainz also questioned the strategy as he proposed the 3-stop race to the team as he was under pressure from George Russell, but that 2-stop strategy worked out for him in the end as he did secure 3rd position. But it was always a challenge for Sainz as the Mercedes looked quick in race pace, and there were suggestions that Ferrari were running more downforce than their opponents, which resulted in higher tyre degradations in the heat of the Grand Prix. But the worst was yet to come for Leclerc and Ferrari, as with their championship contender running in 5th, the team took a gamble to stop the Monegasque driver once again and go for the fastest lap point. But it was a real risk as he ended up coming out of the pits behind Fernando Alonso's Alpine. So Leclerc was forced to overtake the Spanish driver on the final lap and also tried to set the fastest lap of the race at the same time. But while he did get back past Alonso on track, and he did set his fastest time of the Grand Prix, he was still a whopping 0.6 of a second behind Verstappen's fastest lap, which he set on the medium tyre. To add insult to injury, Leclerc then got a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane, as he was 1 km/h faster than the limit. This resulted in him dropping back to 6th in the race, so the team went for the fastest lap, failed to do that, left the driver with an overtake to make on track, and even though he made that overtake, Leclerc still ended up behind Alonso. If that doesn't summarise Charles Leclerc's season, then I don't know what does. It was poor from Ferrari this weekend, so it needs to be a red box for the team once again. For me, they need to beat Mercedes this year if they want to hold on to any hope going into 2023. Honourable mentions. A couple of honourable mentions today, and the first for me goes to George Russell. The Mercedes driver continued his consistent season with 4th, despite the Mercedes car being so far behind their rivals in qualifying trim. But Russell looked like he could have fought for a podium if it wasn't for a mistake as he ran wide, losing time to Sainz. But it was still a very strong performance for Russell on Sunday. The other honourable mention for me goes to Alonso and Alpine. The Spaniard finished 5th in the end and delivered a great result despite having damage to his front wing from the incident on lap 1 where Hamilton left him no space. Likewise, Esteban Ocon went from 16th to 7th as that Alpine car looked awesome around Spa this weekend, and they've actually put some daylight between them and McLaren in the constructors' standings. So those were my 5 things we learned from the Belgian Grand Prix. Let me know what you thought of Verstappen's performance in the comments.